This is the story of the war that made Russia an empire. Welcome to Part 3, the Great Northern War and the Rise of Imperial Russia. He reformed the army with European-style uniforms and tactics. Factories were built, mines were developed, and new canals were dug for transport. Of course, all of this came at a huge cost. To finance this massive system, Peter introduced new taxes. He forced nobles to serve either in the army or in administration, but the real burden fell on the peasants. They paid higher taxes and were forced into labor. So what was all this preparation for? Peter's main goal was to gain access to the Baltic Sea. At that time, these waters were completely controlled by Sweden. In 1700, he launched the Great Northern War, but things did not go well at first. In November of the same year, at the Battle of Narva, the Swedish army heavily defeated Peter's forces. Most leaders would have given up here, but Peter did not. He trained his army more strictly and rebuilt everything from the ground up. The turning point came in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava. The Russian army crushed the Swedish forces, who were considered invincible. Although the war continued for years, the tide had already turned. By treaty, Russia gained access to the sea and took Estonia, Latvia, and part of Finland. This victory changed everything. The Senate granted Peter the titles the Great and Emperor of all Russia. Russia had now become an empire. St. Petersburg rose as the brightest symbol of this new European identity. The military system Peter created would protect the empire for centuries. His institutions laid the foundation of modern Russia. When Peter died, he left behind a massive empire. But this legacy contained deep contradictions, a modernizing Russia on one side and an increasingly absolute ruler on the other. Did this transformation reach all segments of society? Unfortunately, no. The gap between the westernized elite and the traditional population widened. While opportunities opened for talented individuals, life became even harder for peasants. A magnificent capital was built, but at the cost of thousands of lives. Russia was now facing a serious identity crisis, a European power reaching into Asia, or a completely unique civilization of its own. This question would remain unanswered even after Peter, and things became even more complicated. After Peter's death, Russia entered a period of palace coups. The throne was decided by intrigue and the decisions of guard regiments. This instability eventually gave way to one of the most remarkable figures in Russian history. A girl was born in a small German principality. At 14, she was brought to Russia to marry Peter's grandson, Peter III. The young Catherine quickly adapted to her new country. She learned Russian, converted to Orthodoxy, and absorbed the local culture. But there was a problem. Her husband Peter was far from capable of ruling an empire. He despised Russian traditions and preferred playing with toy soldiers instead of spending time with his wife. This marriage was a disaster from the very beginning. Catherine knew her position in the palace was fragile. She was intelligent, ambitious, and a foreign wife of an unpopular heir. In 1762, after Empress Elizabeth died, Peter III became Tsar, but his reign quickly turned into chaos. Peter alienated the church and the army with his decisions. So did Catherine just watch? Of course not. 6 months later, with her ally Gregory Orlov, she planned a coup. Peter was overthrown and soon died under suspicious circumstances. Catherine always denied any involvement in his death. The real issue was legitimacy. She had no direct blood claim. The rightful heir was her son Pavel, but she was determined to prove her worth through conquest and political skill. From the very beginning, Catherine showed she would not be an ordinary ruler. She presented herself as an enlightened ruler, corresponding with thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot. Her goal was to modernize Russia. In 1767, she convened a large commission to rewrite the laws. But in the end, none of those ideas on paper were implemented successfully. The commission failed to produce a new legal code. The real contradiction lay in society itself. While Catherine spoke of freedom, she expanded serfdom into new territories. She even distributed thousands of state peasants as private property to her allies. This injustice eventually led to a massive explosion, the uprising led by Yemelyan Pugachev, which was brutally suppressed. After the uprising, she divided the country into provinces to tighten control and standardize administration. But Catherine's only concern was not power. She brought church lands under state control. She opened the first state schools and medical faculties. She even tested the feared smallpox vaccine on herself to set an example for the people. She also founded shelters for abandoned children, starting a social transformation. Was all of this enough? Of course not. Driven by her passion for art, she founded the Hermitage Museum and turned St. Petersburg into one of Europe's most important cultural centers. In foreign policy, her eyes were always set further ahead. She won 2 major wars against the Ottoman Empire, capturing Crimea and the Black Sea coast. By founding strategic cities like Sevastopol, she extended Russian power to the seas. One of Catherine's most striking moves was participating in the 3 partitions of Poland. Between 1772 and 1795, an entire kingdom was erased from the map. Through this, Russia gained vast territories and millions of new people. However, this expansion brought an unprecedented situation. Among the new population was a large Jewish community that had previously been forbidden from entering Russian lands. To address this issue, Catherine created a special region called the Pale of Settlement, forcing them to live there. This harsh politics outside the palace was matched by a similarly dynamic private life inside it. Catherine's personal life was as colorful as her political career. She was often surrounded by much younger men. She was generous with them, granting titles and lands. Her last companion, played in Zubov, was 40 years younger than her, but these choices were not random. Catherine chose capable men who could assist her intellectually in governing the empire. So what did this ambitious rise ultimately lead to? When she died in 1796, she left behind one of Europe's greatest powers. Russia had become a vast empire stretching to the Black Sea in the south and Central Europe in the west. At that time, Russia seemed to shine from the outside. French was spoken in the palaces, and European fashion and customs were strictly followed. Art and architecture experienced a golden age with strong state support. But what was happening behind this glittering facade? The real issue was this: the country was trapped in deep contradictions. On one side stood the nobility living in extreme luxury. On the other, millions of serfs were chained to the land. Catherine praised Enlightenment ideas, but these modern thoughts were not enough to change the misery of the people. And this is where things began to unravel. Her son, Paul I, came to power with deep resentment toward his mother. As soon as he took the throne, he began reversing her policies. But this oppressive reign ended in 1801. This opened the door to a difficult century for Russia. Alexander came to the throne. Young, intelligent, and reform-minded, he promised freedom and modernization. But in reality, these promises remained on paper, and the serfdom system was not abolished. The Tsar still held absolute power in his own hands. But soon, a development emerged that would overturn all plans. In Europe, a man was rising who was feared everywhere. He was only 1.67 meters tall, but had become the most dominant figure of the era, Napoleon Bonaparte. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Alexander made a difficult decision. He set aside his pride and agreed to a forced alliance with the French emperor. But this so-called friendship was a lie. A renewed confrontation was inevitable. In 1812, everything collapsed. Napoleon marched to the Russian border with over 600,000 soldiers. It was one of the largest invasions in European history. So how did Tsar Alexander respond? Instead of a major battle, he ordered a continuous retreat. The French advanced deeper into Russian territory, but it was not an escape, it was a trap. When Napoleon reached Moscow, he believed he had won a great victory, but he found only flames. The Russians had burned their own capital to deny the enemy supplies and shelter. The real disaster came next, the harsh Russian winter. There was no food and no shelter. Alexander's strategy worked perfectly. Out of 600,000 soldiers, fewer than 30,000 returned. This victory changed everything. Alexander became a national hero, and Russia took a central place in European politics. But when Russian soldiers returned from the Western Front, they were no longer the same men. So what had changed? For the first time, these soldiers had seen a world without serfdom and with personal freedom. Looking at their homeland, all they felt was backwardness. This silent anger erupted in 1825. The Decembrist revolt began right after Alexander's death. However, the new ruler Nicholas hated even the word freedom. He increased censorship and spread the secret police everywhere. For him, every demand for change was a direct threat. Rebels were severely punished, but Nicholas could not stop one thing: ideas. This oppressive environment triggered a rise in Russian art. Writers and musicians began to reveal the people's suffering to the world. But Nicholas's main concern was maintaining order abroad. In 1849, he demonstrated his authority by helping Austria. The real issue was that this harsh stance began to disturb the great powers. In 1853, the Crimean War broke out. What seemed like a simple religious dispute was actually a clash of great powers. Russia stood alone against an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and France. Russian soldiers were brave, but their equipment was outdated and their organization weak. In the end, a heavy defeat became inevitable. This disaster marked a turning point for Russia. During the war, Nicholas died. His son Alexander II inherited a devastated country and realized the old system no longer worked. In 1861, he announced a revolutionary decision, the complete abolition of serfdom. 23 million people were no longer anyone's property. The peasants gained their freedom, but the price was high. They had to repay their former landlords for land with years of debt. In other words, slavery ended, but it was replaced by debt bondage. Still, Alexander did not stop. He reformed the courts, expanded education, and modernized the army. Russia was awakening, but the real question was, would these changes satisfy everyone? Not really. Many believed the reforms were progressing too slowly. Discussions soon turned into violence. A radical group called People's Will achieved its goal in 1881. Ironically, the Tsar was killed on the very day he approved plans for a national assembly. This assassination abruptly halted the winds of reform. The new Tsar, unlike his father, struck the table with an iron fist. He rolled back reforms and imposed a harsh regime on the country. He targeted minorities and demanded that everyone live as Russians. Nicholas II, who came to the throne in 1894, continued this rigid order. In the next episode, we will explore how these contradictions evolved into even greater upheavals.